Our lesson today is still in Luke chapter 9, but it's verses 37 through 62. It says, Jesus continues to heal and to teach. So, and then the focus is on verses 37 through 42 and then verses 57 through 62. But we'll be covering the verses in between too. So, and then a disciple... This is going to tell us what a disciple really is and what they're supposed to do. A disciple is a student that follows the teaching and example of the teacher. Also one who works alongside the teacher to learn. And then when Jesus gave us the Great Commission, he commanded us to make disciples of all nations. This includes leading people to salvation in Jesus Christ first. Second, to submit to scriptural baptism. And third, then teaching them to observe all the things that Jesus has commanded. Jesus is the teacher, we're the student. And in today's lesson, we will observe failures in discipleship. You mean people failed in discipleship back then too? And then the lack of faith that some had. Some just basically refused to deny themselves, and some made excuses. So we're going to study that today. In verse 37, it came to pass that on the next day, when they were come down from the hill, much people met him. In other words, on the next day following the transfiguration experience that Peter, James, and John witnessed, we don't know why the other 9 disciples weren't included in that, but it was just Peter, James, and John that witnessed that miraculous event. And then this is where they had gone with Jesus to pray. In Mark chapter 9 and verses 14 and 15, it says, when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them, and the scribes were questioning with them. And in verse 15, and straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed and running to him to salute him. So everybody, they were happy with Jesus and wanted to be with him, wanted to be have things to do with him. Now in verse 38, it says, and behold, a man of the company cried out, saying, Master, I beseech thee, look upon my son, for he is mine only child. This father was emotional and he's very desperate. His only child was something wrong, and he was begging Jesus to help him. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. So we see that this person, he believed, but he still wanted Jesus to help his unbelief. Maybe he had some doubts or wasn't sure that Jesus would do what he can do. And Mark 9:24 is one that says, and straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Then verse 39, and lo, a spirit taketh him, and he suddenly crieth out, and it teareth him, that he foameth again, and bruising him hardly departeth from him. The father, he's seeing here, I took my son, my father describes his son as being taken by a spirit, which is a demon, causing him to have seizures. Now, this could be a form of epilepsy. Anyway, this is not caused by demon possession. It's a brain disorder that actually causes this. But this particular demon was causing him to have these seizures to make it look like he had epilepsy. And then in verse 40, I besought thy disciples to cast him out, and they could not. In other words, he went and took his son to the disciples, but they could not cast out the demon. And here in verse 41, Jesus answering said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you and suffer you? In other words, Maybe Jesus is aggravated for whatever reason, I don't know. And this was in verse 41 that I was reading this, and Jesus answering said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you and suffer you? Bring thy son, otherwise, bring thy son to me. Here Jesus is likely addressing the disciples, the Father, and the crowd for maybe their lack of faith, or this refers to a lack of trust in God's power and promises. Perverse and twisted, this refers to a spiritual, moral corruption or a straying from the truth. Now in verse 42, and as he was yet coming, the devil threw him down, tear him. Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the child and delivered him again to his father. Again, this act shows that Jesus' absolute authority over evil. This serves as a teaching moment following the disciples' inability to cast out the demon, highlighting their need for faith. So they had a lack of faith is why they couldn't cast out the demon. And why they had the lack of faith, I really don't know. Now in verse 43, and they were all amazed at the mighty power of God, but while they wondered everyone at all things which Jesus did, he said unto his disciples. In other words, he's showing, this is a pivotal point, is showing the popularity and power of Jesus, which he immediately uses to teach the disciples about the necessity of his coming sacrifice. He's getting ready. He has something else ahead of him that he's facing. He's getting ready to teach the disciples about that. And in verse 44, he's saying, let these sayings sink down into your ears, for the Son of Man shall be delivered into the hands of men. He's urging them to be soberly understanding his coming, suffering, and betrayal and crucifixion. He says, I want you to understand what's going to happen later. You know, they're still not getting it. And this is a final warning. The cost of discipleship and the necessity of the cross is encouraging believers to understand that Jesus' glory was accomplished through suffering. The suffering of others is how Jesus' glory originated, by him healing others and taking care of others' peoples that were suffering. Now in verse 45, but they understood not this saying, and it was hid from them, that they perceived it not, and they feared to ask him that saying. You know, despite all the miracles that they seen Jesus do, they still could not reconcile the glory they saw with the suffering Jesus predicted. They still couldn't put the two together. This is a reminder that following Jesus requires letting go of perceived notions and accepting the difficult sacrificial pain of the cross. Now in verse 46, then there arose a reasoning among them, which of them should be the greatest. In other words, they started a debate or disputes among them, among the Lord's disciples, as a covetous, clamoring, or esteeming position in his church for the future. In other words, they were, well, which one of us is going to be the guy? What kind of a job am I going to have? I'm going to have a better job than you or a better job than somebody else. They were reasoning this within their hearts. And then when he was gone, this is in Mark chapter 9, verse 34, they calculated the pros and cons of the future on the basis of what in it for me. We get the true answer. They was wanting to know what's in it for them. They were debating on which is the best and which is the worst. But in verse 34, again, I think it's 35 is what it should be. But they held their peace, for by the way they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. And in verse 47, and Jesus, perceiving their thoughts of their heart, took a child and set him by him. In other words, Jesus knew what they was thinking already. So he's going to show them something else here. Now in verse 48, he says, And he said unto them, Whosoever shall receive this child in my name receiveth me, and whosoever shall receive me receiveth him that sent me. For he that is least among you all, the same shall be great. In other words, the disciples, they were arguing about who was going to be the greatest among them. And Jesus uses a child symbolizing someone with zero social status, power, ability to repay a favor. In other words, he's using this child who's incapable of doing anything like that right now. And it's to represent those who are humble and dependent. Here, we as followers of Jesus Christ should not seek personal glory or position, but should embrace a posture of humility, serving others without expecting anything in return. That's what we should be ready to focus, not expecting them to repay us or to thank us, but we should be willing to serve whatever the cost is. Now in verse 49, John answered and said, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and we forbade him, because he followeth not with us. Here they were acting out of jealousy or pride, believing they held, in other words, they thought they was the only one that had the authority that Jesus had given them. And Jesus, he says, okay, I'm going to correct. He's correcting this by broadening the scope of his ministry. In other words, he's broadening his ministry. They thought that they were the only ones that had the power right now. No one else. They thought they were the only ones. And here, as long as the true Christ is being proclaimed and souls are being saved, other believers should not be discouraged or viewed as rivals. If there's other people that are serving Christ, people are getting saved, we should be praying for them and be happy that they're doing this. And Jesus further clarifies it. He says that those who are not opposing his missions are actually supporting it. So if they're not they're supporting his mission. They're doing what he's commanded them to do. Now in verse 50, Jesus said unto him, Forbid him not, for he that is not against us is for us. They had previously argued about who was the greatest, tried to stop someone outside their group from casting out demons. In other words, he wasn't in their group, so they figured he shouldn't be able to cast out demons. Jesus' response, he rebukes this sectarianism, indicating that the ministry is not restricted to their specific circle. In other words, their circle wasn't the only ones that was out there working and ministering for Jesus. There are others that, not just theirs, there's others there. And he's emphasizing unity in ministry, noting that if someone is advancing the kingdom and not working against Christ, they should be supported. In other words, we should support others that are proclaiming Christ. Now in verse 52, and now he sent messengers before his face, and they entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. Here, he's demonstrating foresight and the logical preparation necessary for his mission. We have to realize that entering a Samaritan village was highly unusual for a Jewish teacher. He's showing a deliberate effort to cross social, cultural, and religious barriers. He's going to do this regardless. Normally, Jewish leaders don't go into a Samaritan community, but he's going in there. He's probably thinking, well, they need to hear about Jesus as much as anybody else does. And then in verse 53, but they did not receive him because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. Now the Samaritans worshipped on Mount Gerizim and rejected the Jewish belief that Jerusalem was the exclusive, divinely appointed center for worship. In other words, they couldn't accept that Jerusalem was the only place appointed for worship. And the villagers, they refused hospitality because they recognized Jesus was a Jew prophet going to the Jewish holy city. In other words, they didn't accept that. They didn't accept him. So, now in verse 54, when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias said? Okay, James and John, they're going to take care of these people because they rejected Jesus. They're going to take care of him. Their nicknames were sons of thunder. Impulsively asking Jesus if they should call down fire from heaven to consume a Samaritan village that refused them hospitality. This verse highlights their misguided zeal and preference for retribution over grace, demonstrating a misunderstanding of Jesus' mission, which was to save rather than destroy. They wasn't getting his total mission, that he had come to save people, not to destroy people. Their nickname highlights their intense, sometimes impulsive temperament, which this story highlights. Now in verse 55, but he turned and rebuked them and said, Ye know not what manner of spirit ye are of. For the Son of Man is not come, this is verse 56, for the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went to another village. This he's highlighting a correction of their misguided, vengeful zeal, emphasizing that Christ's mission is one of salvation, grace, and mercy, not destruction. His main purpose is for salvation, grace, and mercy. He didn't come to destroy the people. Now in verse 57 and verse 58, and it came to pass that as they went in the way, a certain man said unto him, Lord, I will follow thee wherever thou goest. Okay, this one guy said, I'm going to follow you wherever you go. You just tell me and I'll go with you. But Jesus he's revealing that following him may lead to a life of homelessness or instability. Okay, he said, if you're going to follow me, you're not going to have anywhere that you can call permanently home. You may be here one day and here the next day, and it's not going to be a stable thing. So he's trying to get this man to think, if you follow me, you're going to have to give up some things. Now, true discipleship means abandoning self-interest and placing Jesus above personal comfort. In other words, Jesus has got to be first. This is challenging believers to prioritize the kingdom of God over personal material security. This is where Jesus addresses half-hearted or delayed commitment, demanding undivided, immediate devotion. In other words, he wants your full devotion, not partial devotion. He's testing this man's motivation by asking him to consider if he was willing to trade a comfortable life for a life of service in the kingdom. He says, are you sure you want to do this? You're going to have to give up a lot in order to do this. He's trying to get the guy to think before he responds. Now in verse 59, and then he said unto another, follow me. But he said, Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father. That highlights that discipleship cannot wait for convenient time or until personal financial matters are settled. In other words, if you're going to serve, you got to do it now. You can't wait until other things are taken care of. Now, Jesus is not forbidding honoring of parents, But he's challenging the disciples to ensure nothing takes precedence over the call of the gospel. He said the call of the gospel is the most important. Now in verse 60, Jesus said unto him, Let the dead bury their dead, but go thou and preach the kingdom of God. Following Jesus requires immediate top priority commitment over worldly obligations or tradition. He uses dead to mean those who are spiritually dead. Unbelievers is who he's referring to here. Can handle earthly matters, while those called to the life should prioritize spiritual missions. Now in verse 61, and another also said, Lord, I will follow thee, but let me first go and bid them farewell which are at home at my house. Because there's another one that's fine, but he wants to go home and tell his family goodbye and whatever the case is. Jesus, looking back, represents a lack of full commitment, much like a farmer plowing a straight furrow cannot look behind. So you visualize a farmer, he's plowing a straight furrow. He can't be looking behind because the furrow's going to be going off in every different direction. So it's challenging. While bidding farewell was culturally polite, Jesus highlights that spiritual duty overrides social customs. It also challenges believers to prioritize their commitment to Christ over worldly attachments or comforts. Now in verse 62, Jesus said unto him, No man having put his hand to the plow, looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God. Following Christ is not a casual or part-time commitment. Looking back represents letting go of or longing for or old life habits, worldly comforts, or distractions which hinder spiritual growth and ministry. In other words, you can't be looking back. You've got to be focused on the gospel. You've got to be focused ahead. Jesus is calling for a no-looking back commitment that prioritizes God's work above all else. I know we went through this lesson pretty fast, but that's all I have for today. Still talking about discipleship and the cost of following Jesus. It's not a comfortable lifestyle all the time. So I'm open for comments. Bob?
Back at verse 38, 39, and 40. The man didn't have any luck with the disciples.
Right.
To do the healing. And the question is, why couldn't they do it?
Yeah.
If we go back to chapter 9, chapter 9, verse 1.
Right.
We read, Jesus called his 12 disciples together, gave them power and authority over devils and to cure diseases.
Right.
Now, the question is, why did he have to go to Jesus to get it done when he said he already went to the disciples and they couldn't do it? And then in verse 41, Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, "O faithless, perverse generation, how long shall I be with you?" Who's he talking to there? He's talking to his disciples.
Yes, he is.
How long am I going to be with you to do what I've already given you the opportunity to do?
Right.
And a lot of people miss that because we forget about that capital C word, context.
Yeah.
So they had the power. Jesus gave it to them. Here's a man that came there. For some reason, they lacked the faith.
Right.
And he went to Jesus, and Jesus said, "How long am I going to be with you to help you do the things that I've already given you power to do?"
Right.
And I think we ought to look at that ourselves. Because, God has given us the ability to do many things.
Yes, he has.
And about these two fellas that wanted to go do something, but they had other things that at the moment are too important.
Right.
But how many young men say, God called me to preach, God called me to do that, and then after a church recognizes, okay, and without giving much time, they say, okay, we'll do this or we'll do that for you, now you're able to preach. And then right down the line, after they get into maybe the first church that they're given some responsibility, they quit and they're out completely. Pictures already given here.
Yes.
Mentioned before, it's not just given for history. It's giving us what takes place and how Jesus feels about this kind of attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Their attitude, why?
Yeah, they want to, why couldn't they do it?
Maybe we need to take a look at our own lives.
Yeah.
Why can't you do this? You're a member of a church. Why can't you do this? You may not have to preach. You may not have to teach. But there's a lot of things going on in a church that every person in that church should be willing to take a responsibility.
Exactly.
Because it should not go on just a few people's shoulders in order to do it.
That's right. That's right.
Churches are missing that.
Yeah, they are.
We'll be here Sunday morning for preaching service. And that's it.
Yeah, they don't darken the doors of a church any other time, just Sunday morning. Yeah. You don't hear nothing from them.
Again, well, I've got this.
Mm-hmm.
I've got that I want to do, or,
Other things get in the way, of the important mission.
And we see that very clearly in chapter 9.
We sure do. We sure do.
We've seen it in other areas.
Right.
Where one, Jesus said, I've got 12, but one.
Yeah, one of them, he just...
Example, you see. Example. Some of them aren't going to stick with what they said.
That's right.
He was it. So we got to look at it and see why these things are given to us, to understand. We're going to be up against this. Mm-hmm. We're going to be tempted to do these very things. But here's what Jesus thinks about that type of thing and how he's going to deal with you if you go your way and not his way.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
I'll shut up.
That's okay, Bob. I'm glad that you brought that out. There's a lot there that we can learn from that. Does anyone else have comment? Okay, if there's no other comments, Bob, would you dismiss us, please?